This is a continuation of Try to Remember by Frank Herbert, comprising the second part and the end. It was a room dug far underground beneath the ordnance depot, originally for storage of atomics. The walls were lead. It was an oblong space, about 30 by 15 feet with a very low ceiling. 2 trestle tables had been butted end to end in the center of the room to form a single long surface. A series of green-shaded lights suspended above this table gave the scene an odd resemblance to a gambling room. The effect was heightened by the set look to the shoulders of the men sitting in spring-bottom chairs around the table. There were a scattering of uniforms: Air Force, Army, Marines, plus hard-faced civilians in expensive suits. Dr. Langsmith occupied a space at the middle of one of the table's sides and directly across from the room's only door. His gnome features were locked in a frown of concentration. He puffed rhythmically at the stubby pipe like a witchman creating an oracle smoke. A civilian across the table from Langsmith addressed a 2-star general seated beside the team chief. "General Speidel, I still think this is too delicate a spot to risk a woman." Speidel grunted. He was a thin man with a high, narrow face, an aristocratic face that radiated granite convictions and stubborn pride. There was an air about him of spring steel under tension and vibrating to a chord that dominated the room. "Our choice is limited," said Langsmith. "Very few of our personnel have consistently taken wheeled carts into the ship and consistently taken a position close to that force barrier, or whatever it is." Speidel glanced at his wristwatch. "What's keeping them?" "She may already have gone to breakfast," said Langsmith. "Be better if we got her in here hungry and jumpy," said the civilian. "Are you sure you can handle her, Smitty?" asked Speidel. Langsmith took his pipe from his mouth, peered into the stem as though the answer were to be found there. "We've got her pretty well analyzed," he said. "She's a recent widow, you know, bound to still have a rather active death wish structure." There was a buzzing of whispered conversation from a group of officers at one end of the table. Speidel tapped his fingers on the arm of his chair. Presently the door opened. Francine entered. A hand reached in from outside, closed the door behind her. "Ah, there you are, Doctor." "Miller," said Langsmith. He got to his feet. There was a scuffling sound around the table as the others arose. Langsmith pointed to an empty chair diagonally across from him. "Sit down, please." Francine advanced into the light. She felt intimidated, knew she showed it, and the realization filled her with a feeling of bitterness tinged with angry resentment. The ride down the elevator from the surface had been an experience she never wanted to repeat. It had seemed many times longer than it actually was, like a descent into Dante's Inferno. She nodded to Langsmith, glanced covertly at the others, took the indicated chair. It was a relief to get the weight off her trembling knees, and she momentarily relaxed, only to tense up again as the others resumed their seats. She put her hands on the table, immediately withdrew them to hold them clasped tightly in her lap. "Why was I brought here like a prisoner?" she demanded. Langsmith appeared honestly startled. "But I told you last night that I'd send somebody for you." Speidel chuckled easily. "Some of our security boys are a little grim-faced," he said. "I hope they didn't frighten you." She took a deep breath, began to relax. "Is this about the request I made last night?" she asked. "I mean for help in this new line of research?" "In a way," said Langsmith. "But first I'd like to have you answer a question for me." He pursed his lips. I've never asked one of my people for just a wild guess before, but I'm going to break that rule with you. What's your guess as to why these galactics are here?" "Guess?" "Logical assumption, then," he said. She looked down at her hands. "We've all speculated, of course. They might be scientists investigating us for reasons of their own." "Damnation!" barked the civilian beside her. Then, "Sorry, ma'am, but that's the pap we keep using to pacify the public." "And we aren't keeping them very well pacified," said Langsmith. "That group that stormed us last night called themselves the Sons of Truth. They had thermite bombs, and were going to attack the spaceship." "How foolish," she whispered. "How pitiful." "Go on with your guessing, Doctor." "Miller," said Speidel. She glanced at the general, again looked at her hands. "There's the military's idea, that they want Earth for a strategic base in some kind of space war." "It could be," said Speidel. They could be looking for more living space for their own kind, she said. In which case, what happens to the native population? Asked Langsmith. They would either be exterminated or enslaved, I'm afraid. But the Galactics could be commercial traders of some sort, interested in our art forms, our animals for their zoos, our archaeology, our spices, our... She broke off, shrugged. How do we know what they may be doing on the side? Secretly. Exactly, said Speidel. He glanced sidelong at Langsmith. She talks pretty level-headed, Smitty. But I don't believe any of these things, she said. What is it you believe? Asked Speidel. I believe they're just what they represent themselves to be, representatives of a powerful galactic culture that is immeasurably superior to our own. Powerful, all right. It was a Marine officer at the far end of the table. The way they cleaned off any way talk and swept our satellites out of the skies. Do you think there's a possibility they could be concealing their true motives? Asked Langsmith. A possibility, certainly. Have you ever watched a confidence man in action? Asked Langsmith. I don't believe so, but you're not seriously suggesting that these... She shook her head. Impossible. The mark seldom gets wise until it's too late, said Langsmith. She looked puzzled. Mark? The fellow the confidence men choose for a victim. Langsmith relighted his pipe, extinguished the match by shaking it. Dr. Miller, we have a very painful disclosure to make to you. She straightened, feeling a sudden icy chill in her veins at the stillness in the room. Your husband's death was not an accident, said Langsmith. She gasped and turned deathly pale. In the 6 months before this spaceship landed, there were some 28 mysterious deaths, said Langsmith. More than that, really, because innocent bystanders died too. These accidents had a curious similarity. In each instance, there was a fatality of a foremost expert in the field of language, cryptoanalysis, semantics. The people who might have solved this problem died before the problem was even presented, said Speidel. Don't you think that's a curious coincidence? She was unable to speak. In one instance, there was a survivor, said Langsmith. A British jet transport crashed off Ceylon, killing Dr. Ramfit Yu. The lone survivor, the co-pilot, said a brilliant beam of light came from the sky overhead and sliced off the port wing. Then it cut the cabin in half. Francine put a hand to her throat. Langsmith's cautious hand movements suddenly fascinated her. 28 air crashes, she whispered. Number 2 were auto crashes. Langsmith puffed a cloud of smoke before his face. Her throat felt sore. She swallowed, said, But how can you be sure of that? It's circumstantial evidence, yes, said Speidel. He spoke with thin-lipped precision. But there's more. For the past 4 months, all astronomical activity of our nation has been focused on the near heavens, including the moon. Our attention was drawn to evidence of activity near the moon crater Theophilus. We have been able to make out the landing rockets of more than 500 spacecraft. What do you think of that? Asked Langsmith. He nodded behind his smoke screen. She could only stare at him, her lips ashen. These frogs have massed an invasion fleet on the moon, snapped Speidel. It's obvious. They're lying to me, she thought. Why this elaborate pretense? She shook her head, and something her husband had once said leapt unbidden into her mind. Language clutches at us with unseen fingers. It conditions us to the way others are thinking. Through language, we impose upon each other our ways of looking at things. Speidel leaned forward. We have more than 100 atomic warheads aimed at that moon base. One of those warheads will do the job if it gets through. He hammered a fist on the table. But first we have to capture this ship here. Why are they telling me all this? She asked herself. She drew in a ragged breath, said, Are you sure you're right? Of course we're sure. Speidel leaned back, lowered his voice. Why else would they insist we learn their language? The first thing a conqueror does is impose his language on his new slaves. No, wait, she said. That only applies to recent history. You're getting language mixed up with patriotism because of our own imperial history. Bob always said that such misconceptions are a serious hindrance to sound historical scholarship. We know what we're talking about, Doctor. Miller, said Speidel. You're suspicious of language because our imperialism went hand in hand with our language, she said. Speidel looked at Langsmith. You talked to her. If there actually were communication in the sounds these galactics make, you know we'd have found it by now, said Langsmith. You know it. She spoke in sudden anger. I don't know it. In fact, I feel that we're on the verge of solving their language with this new approach we've been working on. Oh, come now, said Speidel. Do you mean that after our finest cryptographers have worked over this thing for 7 months, you disagree with them entirely? No, let her say her piece, said Langsmith. We've tapped a new source of information in attacking this problem, she said. Primitive dances. Dances? Speidel looked shocked. Yes. I think the Galactics' gestures may be their adjectives and adverbs, the full emotional content of their language. Emotion, snapped Speidel. Emotion isn't language. She repressed a surge of anger, said, We're dealing with something completely outside our previous experience. We have to discard old ideas. We know that the habits of a native tongue set up a person's speaking responses. In fact, you can define language as the system of habits you reveal when you speak. Speidel tapped his fingers on the table, stared at the door behind Francine. She ignored his nervous distraction, said, The Galactics use almost the full range of implosive and glottal stops with a wide selection of vowel sounds, fricatives, plosives, voiced and unvoiced. And we note an apparent lack of the usual interfering habits you find in normal speech. This isn't normal speech, blurted Speidel. Those are nonsense sounds. He shook his head. Emotions. All right, she said. Emotions. We're pretty certain that language begins with emotions. Pure emotional actions. The baby pushes away the plate of unwanted food. You're wasting our time, barked Speidel. I didn't ask to come down here, she said. Please. Langsmith put a hand on Speidel's arm. Let Dr. Miller have her say. Emotion, muttered Speidel. Every spoken language of Earth has migrated away from emotion, said Francine. Can you write an emotion on paper? Demanded Speidel. That does it, she said. That really tears it. You're blind. You say language has to be written down. That's part of the magic. Your mind is tied in little knots by academic tradition. Language, General, is primarily oral. People like you, though, want to make it into ritual noise. I didn't come down here for an egghead argument, snapped Speidel. Let me handle this, please, said Langsmith. He made a mollifying gesture toward Francine. Please continue. She took a deep breath. I'm sorry I snapped, she said. She smiled. I think we let emotion get the best of us. Speidel frowned. I was talking about language moving away from emotion, she said. Take Japanese, for example. Instead of saying thank you, they say katajikanai, I am insulted. Or they say kinodoku, which means this poisonous feeling. She held up her hands. This is ritual exclusion of showing emotion. Our Indo-European languages, especially Anglo-Saxon tongues, are moving the same way. We seem to think that emotion isn't quite nice, that... It tells you nothing, barked Speidel. She forced down the anger that threatened to overwhelm her. If you can read the emotional signs, she said, they reveal if a speaker is telling the truth. That's all, General. They just tell you if you're getting at the truth. Any good psychologist knows this, General. Freud said it. If you try to conceal your feelings, every pore oozes betrayal. You seem to think that the opposite is true. Emotions. Dancing. Speidel pushed his chair back. Smitty, I've had as much of this as I can take. Just a minute, said Langsmith. Now, Dr. Miller, I wanted you to have your say because we've already considered these points. Long ago. You're interested in the gestures. You say this is a dance of emotions. Other experts say with equal emphasis that these gestures are ritual combat. Freud, indeed. They ooze betrayal. This chopping gesture they make with the right hand, he chopped the air in illustration, is identical to the karate or judo chop for breaking the human neck. Francine shook her head, put a hand to her throat. She was momentarily overcome by a feeling of uncertainty. Langsmith said, That outward thrust they make with one hand. That's the motion of a sword being shoved into an opponent. They ooze betrayal, all right. She looked from Langsmith to Spidel, back to Langsmith. A man to her right cleared his throat. Langsmith said, "I've just given you 2 examples. We have hundreds more. Every analysis we've made has come up with the same answer. Treachery. The pattern's as old as time. Offer a reward, pretend friendship, get the innocent lamb's attention on your empty hand while you poise the axe in your other hand." Could I be wrong? She wondered. Have we been duped by these galactics? Her lips trembled. She fought to control them, whispered, "Why are you telling me these things? Aren't you at all interested in revenge against the creatures who murdered your husband?" asked Spidel. "I don't know that they murdered him." She blinked back tears. "You're trying to confuse me." And a favorite saying of her husband's came into her mind. A conference is a group of people making a difficult job out of what one person could do easily. The room suddenly seemed too close and oppressive. "Why have I been dragged into this conference?" she demanded. "Why?" "We were hoping you'd assist us in capturing that spaceship," said Langsmith. "Me? Assist you in?" "Someone has to get a bomb past the force screens at the door, the ones that keep sand and dirt out of the ship. We've got to have a bomb inside." "But why me?" "They're used to seeing you wheel in the master recorder on that cart," said Langsmith. "We thought of putting a bomb in." "No." "This has gone far enough," said Spidel. He took a deep breath, started to rise. "Wait," said Langsmith. "She obviously has no feelings of patriotic responsibility," said Spidel. "We're wasting our time." Langsmith said, "The Galactics are used to seeing her with that cart. If we change now, they're liable to become suspicious." "We'll set up some other plan then," said Spidel. "As far as I'm concerned, we can write off any possibility of further cooperation from her." "Your little boy's playing a game," said Francine. "This isn't an exclusive American problem. This is a human problem that involves every nation on Earth." "That ship is on United States soil," said Spidel. "Which happens to be on the only planet controlled by the human species," she said. "We ought to be sharing everything with the other teams, pooling information and ideas to get at every scrap of knowledge." "We'd all like to be idealists," said Spidel. "But there's no room for idealism where our survival is concerned. These frogs have full space travel, apparently between the stars, not just satellites and moon rockets. If we get their ship, we can enforce peace on our own terms." "National survival," she said. "But it's our survival as a species that's at stake." Spidel turned to Langsmith. "This is one of your more spectacular failures, Smitty. We'll have to put her under close surveillance." Langsmith puffed furiously on his pipe. A cloud of pale blue smoke screened his head. "I'm ashamed of you, Doctor." "Miller," he said. She jumped to her feet, allowing her anger full scope at last. "You must think I'm a rotten psychologist," she snapped. "You've been lying to me since I set foot in here." She shot a bitter glance at Spidel. "Your gestures gave you away. The non-communicative emotional gestures, General." "What's she talking about?" demanded Spidel. "You said different things with your mouths than you said with your bodies," she explained. "That means you were lying to me, concealing something vital you didn't want me to know about." "She's insane," barked Spidel. "There wasn't any survivor of a plane crash in Ceylon," she said. "There probably wasn't even the plane crash you described." Spidel froze to sudden stillness, spoke through thin lips. "Has there been a security leak?" "Good Lord." "Look at Dr. Langsmith there," she said, "hiding behind that pipe. And you, General, moving your mouth no more than absolutely necessary to speak, trying to hide your real feelings, oozing betrayal." "Get her out of here," barked Spidel. "You're all logic and no intuition," she shouted. "No understanding of feeling and art. Well, General, go back to your computers, but remember this. You can't build a machine that thinks like a man. You can't feed emotion into an electronic computer and get back anything except numbers. Logic to you, General." "I said get her out of here!" shouted Spidel. He rose half out of his chair, turned to Langsmith, who sat in pale silence. "And I want a thorough investigation. I want to know where the security leak was that put her wise to our plans." "Watch yourself," snapped Langsmith. Spidel took 2 deep breaths, sank back. "They're insane," thought Francine. "Insane," and pushed into a corner. With that kind of fragmentation, they could slip into catatonia, or violence. She felt weak and afraid. Others around the table had arisen. 2 civilians moved up beside Francine. "Shall we lock her up, General?" asked one. Speidel hesitated. Langsmith spoke first. "No. Just keep her under very close surveillance. If we locked her up, it would arouse questions that we don't want to answer." Speidel glowered at Francine. "If you give us away, I'll have you shot." He motioned to have her taken out of the room. When she emerged from the headquarters building, Francine's mind still whirled. Lies, she thought. All lies. She felt the omnipresent sand grate under her feet. Dust hazed the concourse between her position on the steps and the spaceship 100 yards away. The morning sun already had burned off the night chill of the desert. Heat devils danced over the dun surface of the ship. Francine ignored the security agent loitering a few steps behind her, glanced at her wristwatch. 9:20. Hiko will be wondering what's happened to me, she thought. We were supposed to get started by 8. Hopelessness gripped her mind. The spaceship looming over the end of the concourse appeared like a malignant growth, an evil thing crouched ready to envelope and smother her. Could that fool general be right? The thought came to her mind unbidden. She shook her head. No, he was lying. But why did he want me to? Delayed realization broke off the thought. They wanted me to take a small bomb inside the ship, but there was no mention of my escaping. I'd have had to stay with the cart and the bomb to allay suspicions. My God, those beasts expected me to commit suicide for them. They wanted me to blame the Galactics for Bob's death. They tried to build a lie in my mind until I'd fall in with their plan. It's hard enough to die for an ideal, but to give up your life for a lie. Anger coursed through her. She stopped on the steps, stood there shivering. A new feeling of futility replaced the anger. Tears blurred her vision. What can one lone woman do against such ruthless schemers? Through her tears, she saw movement on the concourse. A man in civilian clothes crossing from right to left. Her mind registered the movement with only partial awareness. Man stops, points. She was suddenly alert, tears gone, following the direction of the civilian's extended right arm, hearing his voice shout, "Hey, look at that!" A thin needle of an aircraft stitched a hurtling line across the watery desert sky. It banked, arrowed toward the spaceship. Behind it roared an Air Force jet, delta wings vibrating, sun flashing off polished metal. Tracers laced out toward the airship. Someone's attacking the spaceship, she thought. It's a Russian ICBM. But the needle braked abruptly, impossibly, over the spaceship. Behind it, the Air Force jet's engine died, and there was only the eerie whistling of air burning across its wings. Gently, the needle lowered itself into a fold of the spaceship. It's one of theirs, the Galactics, she realized. Why is it coming here now? Do they suspect attack? Is that some kind of reinforcement? Deprived of its power, the jet staggered, skimmed out to a dust geyser, belly landing in the alkali flats. Sirens screamed as emergency vehicles raced toward it. The confused sounds gave Francine a sudden feeling of nausea. She took a deep breath and stepped down to the concourse, moving without conscious determination, her thoughts in a turmoil. The grating sand beneath her feet was like an emery surface rubbing her nerves. She was acutely conscious of an acrid, burning odor, and she realized with a sudden stab of alarm that her security guard still waited behind her on the steps of the administration building. Vaguely, she heard voices babbling in the building doorways on both sides of the concourse. People coming out to stare at the spaceship and off across the flats where red trucks clustered around the jet. A pebble had worked its way into her right shoe. Her mind registered it, rejected an urge to stop and remove the irritant. An idea was trying to surface in her mind. Momentarily, she was distracted by a bee humming across her path. Quite inanely, her mind dwelt on the thought that the insect was too commonplace for this moment. A mental drunkenness made her giddy. She felt both elated and terrified. Danger! Yes. Terrible danger, she thought. Obliteration for the entire human race. But something. An explosion rocked the concourse, threw her stumbling to her hands and knees. Sand burned against her palms. Dumb instinct brought her back to her feet. Another explosion, farther away to the right, behind the buildings. Bitter smoke swept across the concourse. Abruptly, men lurched from behind the buildings on the right, slogging through the sand toward the spaceship. Civilians, possibly. And yet they moved with the purposeful unity of soldiers. It was like a dream scene to Francine. The men carried weapons. She stopped, saw the gleam of sunlight on metal, heard the peculiar crunch-crunch of men running in sand. Through a dreamy haze, she recognized one of the runners. Zakheim. He carried a large black box on his shoulders. His red hair flamed out in the group like a target. The Russians, she thought. They've started their attack. If our people join them now, it's the end. A machine gun stuttered somewhere to her right. Dust puffs walked across the concourse, swept into the running figures. Men collapsed, but others still slogged toward the spaceship. An explosion lifted the leaders, sent them sprawling. Again, the machine gun chattered. Dark figures lay on the sand like thrown dominoes. But still, a few continued their mad charge. MPs in American uniforms ran out from between the buildings on the right. The leaders carried submachine guns. We're stopping the attack, thought Francine. But she knew the change of tactics did not mean a rejection of violence by Speidel and the others. It was only a move to keep the Russians from taking the lead. She clenched her fists, ignored the fact that she stood exposed, a lone figure in the middle of the concourse. Her senses registered an eerie feeling of unreality. Machine guns renewed their chatter and then abrupt silence. But now the last of the Russians had fallen. Pursuing MPs staggered. Several stopped, wrenched at their guns. Francine's shock gave way to cold rage. She moved forward, slowly at first, and then striding. Off to the left, someone shouted, "Hey, lady, get down!" She ignored the voice. There on the sand ahead was Zakheim's pitiful, crumpled figure. A gritty redness spread around his chest. Someone ran from between the buildings on her left, waved at her to go back. Hiko. But she continued her purposeful stride, compelled beyond any conscious willing to stop. She saw the red-headed figure on the sand as though she peered down a tunnel. Part of her mind registered the fact that Hiko stumbled, slowing his running charge to intercept her. He looked like a man clawing his way through water. Dear Hiko, she thought, I have to get to Zach. Poor, foolish Zach. That's what was wrong with him the other day at the conference. He knew about this attack and was afraid. Something congealed around her feet, spread upward over her ankles, quickly surged over her knees. She could see nothing unusual, but it was as though she had plowed into a pool of molasses. Every step took terrible effort. The molasses pool moved above her hips, her waist. So that's why Hiko and the MPs are moving so slowly, she thought. It's a defensive weapon from the ship. Must be. Zakheim's sprawled figure was only 3 steps away from her now. She wrenched her way through the congealed air, panting with the exertion. Her muscles ached from the effort. She knelt beside Zakheim. Ignoring the blood that stained her skirt, she took up one of his outstretched hands, felt for a pulse. Nothing. Now she recognized the marks on his jacket. They were bullet holes. A machine gun burst had caught him across the chest. He was dead. She thought of the big garrulous redhead, so full of blooming life only minutes before. Poor, foolish Zach. She put his hand down gently, shook the tears from her eyes. A terrible rage swelled in her. She sensed Ohashi nearby, struggling toward her, heard him gasp, "Is Zach dead?" Tears dripped unheeded from her eyes. She nodded. Yes, he is. And she thought, I'm not crying for Zach. I'm crying for myself, for all of us. So foolish, so determined, so blind. Earth people! The voice roared from the spaceship, cutting across all thought, stilling all emotion into a waiting fear. We had hoped you could learn to communicate, roared the voice. You have failed! Vibrant silence. Thoughts that had been struggling for recognition began surging to the surface of Francine's mind. She felt herself caught in the throes of a mental earthquake, her soul brought to a crisis as sharp as that of giving birth. The crashing words had broken through a last barrier in her mind. Communicate! At last she understood the meaning of the ultimatum. But was it too late? No! She screamed. She surged to her feet, shook a fist at the ship. "Here's one who didn't fail. I know what you meant." She shook both fists at the ship. "See my hate." Against the almost tangible congealing of air, she forced her way toward the now silent ship, thrust out her left hand toward the dead figures on the sand all around her. "You killed these poor fools. What did you expect from them? You did this. You forced them into a corner." The doors of the spaceship opened. 5 green-skinned figures emerged. They stopped, stood staring at her, their shoulders slumped. Simultaneously, Francine felt the thickened air relax its hold upon her. She strode forward, tears coursing down her cheeks. "You made them afraid!" she shouted. "What else could they do? The fearful can't think." Sobs overcame her. She felt violence shivering in her muscles. There was a terrible desire in her, a need to get her hands on those green figures, to shake them, hurt them. "I hope you're proud of what you've done." "Quiet!" boomed the voice from the ship. "I will not!" she screamed. She shook her head, feeling the wildness that smothered her inhibitions. "Oh, I know you were right about communicating, but you were wrong too. You didn't have to resort to violence." The voice from the ship intruded on a softer tone, all the more compelling for the change. "Please?" There was a delicate sense of pleading to the word. Francine broke off. She felt that she had just awakened from a lifelong daze, but that this clarity of thought come action was a delicate thing she could lose in the wink of an eye. "We did what we had to do," said the voice. "You see our 5 representatives there?" Francine focused on the slump-shouldered galactics. They looked defeated, radiating sadness. The gaping door of the ship a few paces behind was like a mouth ready to swallow them. "Those 5 are among the 800 survivors of a race that once numbered 6 billion, said the voice. Francine felt Ohashi move up beside her, glanced sidelong at him, then back to the galactics. Behind her, she heard a low mumbling murmur of many voices. The slow beginning of reaction to her emotional outburst made her sway. A sob caught in her throat. The voice from the ship rolled on. This once great race did not realize the importance of unmistakable communication. They entered space in that sick condition. Hating, fearing, fighting. There was appalling bloodshed on their side and ours, before we could subdue them. A scuffing sound intruded as the 5 green-skinned figures shuffled forward. They were trembling, and Francine saw glistening drops of wetness below their crests. Their eyes blinked. She sensed the aura of sadness about them, and new tears welled in her eyes. The 800 survivors, to atone for the errors of their race and to earn the right of further survival, developed a new language, said the voice from the ship. It is, perhaps, the ultimate language. They have made themselves the masters of all languages to serve as our interpreters. There was a long pause. Then, think very carefully, Mrs. Miller. Do you know why they are our interpreters? The held breath of silence hung over them. Francine swallowed past the thick tightness in her throat. This was the moment that could spell the end of the human race, or could open new doors for them, and she knew it. Because they cannot lie, she husked. Then you have truly learned, said the voice. My original purpose in coming down here just now was to direct the sterilization of your planet. We thought that your military preparations were a final evidence of your failure. We see now that this was merely the abortive desperation of a minority. We have acted in haste. Our apologies. The green-skinned galactics shuffled forward, stopped 2 paces from Francine. Their ridged crests drooped, shoulders sagged. Slay us, croaked one. His eyes turned toward the dead men on the sand around them. Francine took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped at her damp eyes. Again she felt the bottomless sense of futility. Did it have to be this way? She whispered. The voice from the ship answered. Better this than a sterile planet. The complete destruction of your race. Do not blame our interpreters. If a race can learn to communicate, it can be saved. Your race can be saved. First, we had to make certain you held the potential. There will be pain in the new ways, no doubt. Many still will try to fight us, but you have not yet erupted fully into space where it would be more difficult to control your course. Why couldn't you have just picked some of us? Tested a few of us, she demanded. Why did you put this terrible pressure on the entire world? What if we had picked the wrong ones? Asked the voice. How could we be certain with a strange race such as yours that we had a fair sampling of your highest potential? Number all of you had to have the opportunity to learn of our problem. The pressure was to be certain that your own people chose their best representatives. Francine thought of the unimaginative rulebook followers who had led the teams. She felt hysteria close to the surface. So close, so hellishly close. Ohashi spoke softly beside her. Francine? It was a calming voice that subdued the hysteria. She nodded. A feeling of relief struggled for recognition within her, but it had not penetrated all nerve channels. She felt her hands twitching. Ohashi said, "They are speaking English with you. What of their language that we were supposed to solve?" "We leaped to a wrong conclusion, Hiko," she said. "We were asked to communicate. We were supposed to remember our own language, the language we knew in childhood, and that was slowly lost to us through the elevation of reason." "Ah," sighed Ohashi. All anger drained from her now, and she spoke with sadness. "We raised the power of reason, the power of manipulating words, above all other faculties. The written word became our God. We forgot that before words there were actions, that there have always been things beyond words. We forgot that the spoken word preceded the written one. We forgot that the written forms of our letters came from ideographic pictures, that standing behind every letter is an image like an ancient ghost. The image stands for natural movements of the body or of other living things." "The dances," whispered Ohashi. "Yes, the dances," she said. "The primitive dances did not forget, and the body did not forget. Not really." She lifted her hands, looked at them. "I am my own past. Every incident that ever happened to every ancestor of mine is accumulated within me." She turned, faced Ohashi. He frowned. "Memory stops at the beginning of your—" "And the body remembers beyond," she said. "It's a different kind of memory, insisted in an overlay of trained responses like the thing we call language. We have to look back to our childhood because all children are primitives. Every cell of a child knows the language of emotional movements, the clutching reflexes, the wails and contortions, the sensuous twistings, the gentle reassurances." "And you say these people cannot lie," murmured Ohashi. Francine felt the upsurge of happiness. It was still tainted by the death around her, and the pain she knew was yet to come for her people. But the glow was there, expanding. "The body," she said, and shook her head at the scowl of puzzlement on Ohashi's face. "The intellect—" She broke off, aware that Ohashi had not yet made the complete transition to the new way of communicating, that she was still most likely the only member of her race even aware of the vision on this high plateau of being. Ohashi shook his head and sunlight flashed on his glasses. "I'm trying to understand," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Hiko, all of our Earth languages have a bias toward insanity, because they split off the concept of intellect from the concept of body. That's an oversimplification, but it will do for now. You get fragmentation this way, you see? Schizophrenia. These people now—" She gestured toward the silent galactics. "They have reunited body and intellect in their communication, a gestalten thing that requires the total being's participation. They cannot lie because that would be to lie to themselves, and this would completely inhibit speech." She shook her head. "Speech is not the word, but it is the only word we have now." "A paradox," said Ohashi. She nodded. "The self that is one cannot lie to the self. When body and intellect say the same thing, that is truth. When words and wordlessness agree, that is truth. You see?" Ohashi stood frozen before her, eyes glistening behind the thick lenses. He opened his mouth, closed it, then bowed his head. In that moment, he was the complete Oriental, and Francine felt that she could look through him at all of his ancestry, seeing and understanding every culture and every person that had built to the point of the pyramid here in one person, Hiko Ohashi. "I see it," he murmured. It was example they showed, not words to decipher. Only example for recognition, to touch our memories and call them forth. What great teachers! What great masters of being! One of the galactics stepped closer, gestured toward the area behind Francine. His movements and the intent were clear to her, interpreted through her new understanding. The galactic's wide lips moved. "You are being recorded," he said. "It would be an opportune moment to begin the education of your people, since all new things must have a point of birth." She nodded, steeling herself before turning. Even with the pain of birth, she thought, this was the moment that would precipitate the avalanche of change. Without knowing precisely how she would set off this chain reaction, she had no doubt that she would do it. Slowly, she turned, saw the movie cameras, the television lenses, the cone microphones all directed at her. People were pressed up against an invisible wall that drew an arc around the ship's entrance and this charmed circle where she stood. Part of the ship's defenses, she thought, a force field to stop intruders. A muted murmuring came from the wall of people. Francine stepped toward them, saw the lenses and microphones adjust. She focused on angry faces beyond the force field, and faces with fear, and faces with nothing but a terrible awe. In the foreground, well within the field, lay Zakheim's body, one hand outstretched and almost pointing at her. Silently, she dedicated this moment to him. "Listen to me very carefully," she said. "But more important, see beyond my words to the place where words cannot penetrate." She felt her body begin to tingle with a sudden release of energy. Briefly, she raised herself onto her toes. "If you see the truth of my message, if you see through to this place that I show you, then you will enter a higher order of existence, happier, sadder. Everything will take on more depth. You will feel more of all the things there are in this universe for us to feel." Her newfound knowledge was like a shoring up within, a bottomless well of strength. "All the window widows of all the lonely homes of earth am I," she said, and she bent forward. It was suddenly not Dr. Francine Miller, psychologist, there on the sand. By the power of mimesis, she projected the figure of a woman in a house dress leaning on a windowsill, staring hopelessly into an empty future. And all the happy innocence seeking pain. Again, she moved. The years peeled away from her. And now, she picked up a subtle rhythm of words and movements that made experienced actors cry with envy when they saw the films. "Nature building. Nature's thunder am I," she chanted, her body swaying. "Red roses budding, and the trout thudding water, and the moon pounding out stars. On an ocean wake, all these am I. A fast hurling motion am I. What you think I am, that I am not. Dreams tell your senses all my names. Not harshly loud or suddenly neglectful, sarcastic, preoccupied, or rebukeful. But murmuring. You abandoned a 12-hour day for a 12-hour night. To meddle carefully with eternity. Then you realize the cutting hesitancy. That prepares a star for wishing. When you see my proper image. A candle flickering am I. Then you will feel the lonely intercourse of the stars. Remember, remember, remember. The end. Best Audiobooks for Free hopes that you have enjoyed this production of Try to Remember by Frank Herbert. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great, free content. Please look to our website at bestaudiobooksforfree.com for a complete list of our audiobooks.